Hi, I'm Zara Novak, and 3 days before Christmas last year, I watched my sister Brooke deliberately sabotage 5 years of blood, sweat, and sleepless nights. She destroyed my custom jewelry business with surgical precision, timing it perfectly when I was most vulnerable. But here's the thing about underestimating someone who builds beauty from raw metal and stone. We know how to forge something stronger from the wreckage. By New Year's Eve, I owned her husband's marketing company, and she found out the same way I discovered her betrayal, completely by accident at the worst possible moment. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning it all started, I was hunched over my jewelry bench in the Pearl District, carefully setting the final emerald into a custom engagement ring that would pay my rent for 2 months. December 22nd, 8 a.m., and Portland's winter drizzle painted my studio windows in that familiar gray that makes you grateful for warm coffee and focused work. My hands moved with the precision that comes from thousands of hours of practice, each tool an extension of my thought. This ring wasn't just a piece of jewelry, it was rent money, grocery money, and proof that I'd built something real from nothing but determination and a small business loan that still kept me awake some nights. Meridian Designs had taken 5 years to build, from a corner of my one-bedroom apartment to this actual studio space with proper lighting and a small showroom. 5 years of learning that building a business meant saying no to almost everything else. No to weekend trips when everyone else was posting Instagram stories from wine country. No to expensive dinners when friends suggested places where appetizers cost more than my daily food budget. No to the kind of shopping sprees my sister Brooke considered essential self-care. Every dollar that didn't go to basic survival went back into the business: better tools, better materials, building a reputation, one satisfied customer at a time. The ring caught the light perfectly as I made the final adjustment. Miss Patterson would pick it up this afternoon, and her fiancé would propose on Christmas Eve. 3 months of back-and-forth emails, sketches, revisions, and careful sourcing had led to this moment. The emerald was Colombian, the setting platinum, and the design completely unique to their love story. This was why I'd left my comfortable but soul-crushing tech job 4 years ago. Every piece I created carried someone's dreams, their hopes, their promises to each other. My phone buzzed against the workbench. A text from Tessa Kim, my best friend since college, and the only person who'd supported my decision to leave tech for something that made sense to my heart, instead of just my bank account. Coffee later, I have news about the Morrison wedding commission. I smiled, setting the phone aside. Tessa worked as a wedding planner, and her referrals had become the backbone of my custom engagement ring business. She understood what it meant to build something beautiful from scratch, to take someone's most important moment and help them mark it with something that would last generations. The studio door chimed, and I looked up expecting Mrs. Patterson, but instead saw my sister Brooke pushing through with that particular energy she brought to every space, like she was auditioning for a reality show that didn't exist. She wore a cream-colored coat that probably cost more than my monthly studio rent, her dark hair perfectly styled, despite the Portland drizzle, carrying herself with the confidence of someone who'd never worried about whether a commission would come through. "Zara, thank God you're here," she said, not bothering with hello. "I need a favor, and I need it today." I set down my tools carefully, already feeling that familiar tightness in my chest that came with Brooke's favor. They were never really favors, they were demands dressed up in emergency language, designed to make saying no seem selfish and cruel. "What's going on?" "Marcus has this huge client event tonight, last-minute thing, and I promised him I could get custom jewelry pieces for the VIP gift bags. Nothing too expensive, just something elegant that shows we pay attention to details. You know how important this contract is for us." I blinked at her, trying to process what she was asking. "Brooke, it's December 22nd. I don't have inventory sitting around for last-minute corporate gifts. Everything I make is custom, and I'm booked solid through January." "I'm not asking for anything complicated," she continued, as if I hadn't spoken, "just some simple pieces: earrings, maybe a few necklaces. You have materials here, right? It's not like you're busy today anyway. Not busy today. I looked at the engagement ring, at the 3 other pieces in various stages of completion on my bench, at the custom orders chart that covered one entire wall of my studio. Not busy, except for the $5,000 worth of commissioned work that depended on my complete attention and expertise. Brooke, I have client pickups today, and these pieces require specific timelines. I can't just whip up corporate gifts between commissioned work. The techniques don't work that way. Her expression shifted, the practiced smile sliding into something harder. I told Marcus I could count on you. This client could be worth $200,000 to his agency. You're telling me you can't spare a few hours to help your own family? There it was, the pivot that made my refusal about character instead of logistics. The way she framed family obligation as something that should override professional responsibility, as if my business was a hobby that could be interrupted whenever her priorities demanded. I'd been here before, in different versions of this conversation, and each time I said yes, I lost something. Time, money, credibility, with my actual clients. It's not about wanting to help, I said, trying to keep my voice steady. It's about capacity. I literally cannot produce quality pieces in a few hours. Custom jewelry doesn't work that way. Fine, she said, her tone clipping short. I guess I'll have to figure something else out. I just thought family might mean something to you. She turned to leave, then paused at the door with the kind of dramatic timing that suggested she'd planned this moment. You know, Zara, sometimes I wonder if you left tech just to have an excuse to say no to everyone. Some of us are building real businesses that actually matter. The door chimed behind her, leaving me alone with the smell of her expensive perfume and the familiar ache of being simultaneously dismissed and blamed. I stood there for a moment, letting her words settle into the space she'd just vacated. Real businesses that actually matter. As if the ring in my hands, the 3 months of careful work it represented, the tears of joy I'd seen when clients first held pieces I'd created for them, as if none of that qualified as real or meaningful. I picked up the emerald ring again, checking the setting one more time. Miss Patterson would arrive in 4 hours, and her happiness when she saw this piece would remind me why I'd chosen this path. Not because it was easy, and certainly not because it impressed people like Brooke, but because it connected me to something larger than quarterly profits and client events. Every piece I created became part of someone's story, and that felt more real than anything I'd ever accomplished sitting in a cubicle optimizing user interfaces. The morning passed in the focused quiet I'd learned to treasure. Each tool had its place, each technique its purpose, each piece demanding complete presence. This was meditation, therapy, and challenge all wrapped into the simple act of creating something beautiful that would outlast whatever drama had prompted its existence. By lunch, I'd finished the final polish on Mrs. Patterson's ring and started the delicate work of setting tiny diamonds into a wedding band that would complement the engagement ring I'd completed last month. My phone buzzed with a call from my mother, Diane. I almost let it go to voicemail. Family conversations rarely improved my workday, but guilt won over wisdom. Zara, honey, are you coming to Christmas Eve dinner tomorrow night? Of course, Mom. Same as every year's. Good, because I wanted to make sure you knew that Marcus's parents will be joining us this year. Brooke thought it would be nice to include them, and you know how important it is to make a good impression. I felt that familiar twist in my stomach. Christmas Eve had always been immediate family only, a tradition that stretched back to my childhood. The addition of Marcus's parents wasn't inherently problematic, but the way it was being presented as something already decided with my compliance assumed, felt like another small erasure of my place in family decision. That sounds nice, I said, because arguing would accomplish nothing except making me the difficult one. Should I bring anything besides the usual dessert? Actually, Brooke is handling dessert this year. She ordered something special from that bakery downtown. Maybe you could just bring wine. Another small shift. Another tradition quietly reassigned. I'd been making the Christmas Eve dessert for 8 years, ever since I'd moved back to Portland after college. It wasn't about the dessert itself, it was about the pattern of having my contributions replaced without discussion, as if my role in family traditions was optional and interchangeable. Sure, Mom, wine it is, you're such a sweetheart. Oh, and Zara, Try to be social tomorrow night. I know you're tired from work, but Marcus's parents are lovely people and first impressions matter. Try to be social, as if my natural personality was some kind of obstacle to overcome, some flaw that required conscious correction. I said goodbye and set the phone aside, returning to the diamond setting that required my complete attention. At least here, precision was valued over performance. Mrs. Patterson arrived at exactly 2 o'clock, prompt and nervous in the way that meant this ring represented more than jewelry to her. She was in her early 30s, a teacher whose fiancé had saved for 8 months to afford a custom piece. When I opened the velvet box and she saw her ring for the first time, her hand flew to her mouth and tears sprang to her eyes. "Oh my God," she whispered. "It's perfect. It's exactly what I imagined, but better." This was why I'd left tech, not for moments like these specifically, but for the possibility of them, for work that connected directly to human joy instead of abstract metrics. Miss Patterson tried on the ring and it fit perfectly, the emerald catching the studio lights like captured starlight. "He's going to die," she said, laughing through happy tears. "This is so much more beautiful than anything we could have found in a store." We completed the transaction and I walked her to the door, watching her practically float down the sidewalk toward her car. She'd be engaged by Christmas morning, wearing a ring that would never exist anywhere else in the world. No mass production, no corporate gift bag, no marketing strategy, just one woman's vision brought to life through months of careful work. The rest of the afternoon passed in the steady rhythm of progress. I completed the diamond setting, responded to emails from 3 potential January clients, and updated my project timeline spreadsheet. By 5 o'clock I was ready to lock up and head home to prepare for Christmas Eve dinner with Marcus's parents and whatever subtle performance expectations would come with their presence. Tessa texted just as I was turning off the studio lights. "Rain check on coffee. Emergency bride situation. Call you tomorrow?" I smiled, typing back a quick no problem before stepping out into the December evening. Portland's winter darkness had settled over the Pearl District, and the holiday lights, strung between buildings, created pools of warm color against the wet pavement. I pulled my jacket closer and walked toward my car, thinking about the wine I needed to pick up and whether I had anything in my closet appropriate for impressing Marcus's parents. The drive to my apartment took me through the neighborhoods where I'd grown up, past the coffee shops and bookstores that had shaped my teenage years. Lake Oswego, where my parents still lived, was only 20 minutes away but felt like a different world. Manicured lawns and expensive cars, the kind of suburb where success was measured in square footage and property value. I'd loved growing up there, but I'd also felt the weight of its expectations, the assumption that happiness followed a specific formula that included the right job, the right marriage, the right address. Moving to the Pearl District had been my quiet rebellion against that formula. My apartment was small but mine, filled with jewelry-making supplies and books and plants that somehow survived, despite my irregular schedule. The rent was reasonable by Portland standards, the neighbors were artists and writers, and people who understood that success looked different for everyone. I poured a glass of wine and settled onto my couch with my laptop, reviewing the next week's work schedule. 3 custom pieces to finish, 2 new consultations, and a wedding band set that would challenge every skill I'd developed over the past 5 years. The Morrison Wedding Commission, Tessa had mentioned, would add another layer of complexity, but it would also pay enough to cover my studio rent for 3 months. My phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. "Hi, this is Marcus Caldwell. Brooke gave me your number. Could we set up a time to discuss a potential business collaboration? I think there might be some interesting opportunities to explore." I stared at the message, trying to decode what business collaboration might mean. Marcus ran a digital marketing agency, and I made custom jewelry. The overlap wasn't immediately obvious, unless this was related to Brooke's earlier request for corporate gifts. Maybe she'd convinced him to approach me differently, to frame it as a business opportunity instead of a family favor. I typed back a polite response suggesting we could talk after the holidays, then set the phone aside. Whatever Marcus had in mind, it could wait until I'd finished my existing commitment. One thing I'd learned in 5 years of running my own business was that opportunities that required immediate decisions were rarely as urgent as they seemed. The next morning, Christmas Eve day, I woke to the sound of rain against my windows and the familiar weight of family dinner anxiety. Not anxiety about seeing my parents. I loved them, despite their tendency to echo Brooke's perspective on my life choices, but anxiety about performing the version of myself that made family gatherings smooth and pleasant. The version that smiled through subtle criticisms and didn't mention when traditions were changed without consultation. I spent the morning in my studio, putting finishing touches on an anniversary necklace that would be ready for pickup after the holiday. The work was meditative, requiring enough concentration to quiet the part of my mind that wanted to rehearse conversations that might never happen. By noon, I'd completed everything that absolutely had to be finished before Christmas, leaving me free to focus on wine selection and whatever social preparation would help me navigate dinner with Marcus's parents. The wine shop in my neighborhood specialized in small producers and unusual varieties, the kind of place where the staff knew their inventory personally and could recommend something perfect for any occasion. I explained the situation: family dinner, first-time guests, wanting to make a good impression without overshadowing the hosts, and left with a bottle of Oregon Pinot Noir that struck the right balance between thoughtful and appropriate. Back home, I tried on 3 different outfits before settling on something that felt like myself while meeting my mother's definition of social. Dark jeans, a green sweater that brought out my eyes, minimal jewelry that showcased my design aesthetic without being too obviously promotional. I looked like someone who took care of herself without trying too hard, which felt like the right note for an evening that would inevitably include questions about my business, my personal life, and my general adherence to whatever timeline my parents considered normal for women my age. The drive to Lake Oswego took me through neighborhoods that grew progressively more expensive, houses that started as modest post-war bungalows and evolved into custom contemporary designs with 3-car garages and landscaping that required professional maintenance. My parents' house fell somewhere in the middle, large enough to feel successful, traditional enough to seem sensible, with the kind of curb appeal that photographed well for holiday cars. Brooke's car was already in the driveway when I arrived, along with a silver BMW I didn't recognize that presumably belonged to Marcus's parents. I sat in my car for a moment, checking my reflection, and taking the deep breath that had become my pre-family gathering ritual. Not because I didn't love them, but because love and comfort weren't always the same thing. My mother opened the door before I could knock, enveloping me in a hug that smelled like her signature perfume and the cinnamon candles she lit every December. "Zara, honey, you look wonderful. Come in, come in." Everyone's in the living room. The house felt exactly the same as it had throughout my childhood: warm lighting, comfortable furniture, family photos covering every surface except the ones Brooke had convinced my mother looked cluttered. Holiday music played softly in the background, and the dining room table was set with the good china that only appeared for special occasions and family events that included people my parents wanted to impress. In the living room, Marcus stood near the fireplace with a man and woman who were clearly his parents, holding drinks and engaged in the kind of polite conversation that preceded deeper familiarity. Brooke sat on the couch beside my father, gesturing animatedly as she told some story that had everyone's attention. She looked perfect in the effortless way that seemed to require tremendous effort: hair styled but not overdone, makeup that enhanced her natural beauty without appearing obvious, an outfit that probably cost more than my monthly grocery budget, but looked casually expensive rather than trying too hard. "Zara," my father called out, standing to give me a hug, "come meet the Caldwells. Robert, Patricia, this is our younger daughter, the artist I was telling you about." The artist, not our daughter who runs her own business, or Zara, who creates custom jewelry. The artist, which sounded both more romantic and less serious than what I actually did. I smiled and shook hands with Marcus's parents, accepting the glass of wine my mother pressed into my hand, and settling into the conversation with the practiced ease that came from years of family gathering. Patricia Caldwell was elegant in the understated way that suggested money without displaying it, asking thoughtful questions about my work that demonstrated genuine interest rather than polite obligation. Robert was quieter but warm, the kind of father who clearly adored his son and wanted to understand the family he'd married into. They were lovely people, which somehow made the evening feel more loaded with potential for things to go wrong. "Zara makes the most incredible pieces," my mother was saying, She left a very good job in technology to pursue her passion. We're so proud of her dedication to her art. Her art, another diminutive that made my business sound like a hobby, something admirable but not quite serious. I smiled and thanked her, steering the conversation towards safer topics like the weather and holiday plans. Brooke jumped in with stories about her real estate success, the luxury properties she'd been showing, the market trends that suggested smart buyers should act quickly if they wanted to secure their dream home. Speaking of real estate, Marcus said, Brooke found us the most amazing investment property last month, a historic building downtown that we're converting into office space, perfect location for expanding the agency. That's wonderful, I said, because it was the appropriate response and because their success didn't diminish my own. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Growing businesses are always exciting. Actually, Marcus continued, that's partly why I texted you yesterday. I've been thinking about ways to incorporate local artisans into our client events and promotional campaigns. There's real value in authentic, handcrafted elements, especially for companies that want to differentiate themselves in the market. I felt the conversation shifting into territory that required more attention. Marcus was talking about business, not family favors, and his tone suggested he'd given this real thought rather than responding to pressure from Brooke. What kind of incorporation were you thinking about? Custom pieces for client gifts, obviously, but also partnership opportunities, co-branded events, artisan showcases, maybe even developing signature pieces for some of our higher-end clients. The kind of collaboration that benefits everyone involved. It sounded promising in theory, the kind of partnership that could provide steady income while expanding my client base. But something about the timing felt off. Yesterday's emergency request for corporate gifts, followed immediately by a more sophisticated business proposal. I filed the feeling away for later consideration and focused on learning more about what he had in mind. The conversation continued through dinner, flowing naturally between business ideas and family stories, holiday traditions and plans for the new year. Marcus's parents shared tales of their son's childhood entrepreneurial ventures, and my parents reciprocated with stories that painted both Brooke and me as ambitious children who'd always known what they wanted to achieve. It should have been lovely, and in many ways it was. Good food, kind people, the sort of warm family gathering that looked perfect from the outside. But underneath the surface conversation, I felt the familiar undercurrent of comparison that seemed to follow every interaction with Brooke. Her real estate success versus my artist's dedication, her growing client base versus my custom commissions, her expanding business versus my specialized craft. Not competition exactly, because we weren't in the same field, but a constant measuring that left me feeling like I was always defending choices that shouldn't require justification. The choice to prioritize creativity over maximum profit. The choice to build something slowly and sustainably rather than scaling aggressively. The choice to value client relationships over market expansion. After dinner, as we moved back to the living room for dessert and coffee, Brooke's phone buzzed with what seemed to be an urgent message. She frowned at the screen, then looked up with an expression of concern. Marcus, honey, there's an issue with the Henderson account. Something about the holiday campaign launch. I think you need to call them. Marcus excused himself to handle the call, and the conversation shifted to lighter topics. Patricia's volunteer work at the art museum, Robert's upcoming retirement, my mother's plans for redecorating the guest room. Normal family conversation that felt safe and easy, without the subtle tension that seemed to surround discussions of business and success. When Marcus returned, his expression was strained. Sorry about that. Client emergency that couldn't wait until after Christmas. Everything okay? I asked, because he looked genuinely upset.
It will be.
Just a miscommunication about deliverables that needs to be sorted out before their New Year's launch. The joys of running your own business, right? I nodded, understanding the weight of client emergencies, and the way they could transform a peaceful evening into a stress-filled scramble to prevent disaster. The holidays make everything more complicated when deadlines are involved. Exactly. which is actually part of why your business model appeals to me. Custom work with clear timelines and defined expectations, much more manageable than dealing with corporate clients who change their minds every 5 minutes. The evening wound down naturally, with promises to continue discussing potential collaborations after the new year, and genuine expressions of pleasure at meeting each other's families. As we said our goodbyes, Patricia Caldwell took my hand and told me how much she'd enjoyed learning about my work. "Marcus is right about the value of authentic craftsmanship," she said. "In a world of mass production, there's something special about pieces that carry the artist's individual touch." I drove home feeling cautiously optimistic about the possibilities Marcus had outlined, despite my initial wariness about mixing family relationships with business venture. His parents were lovely, his appreciation for my work seemed genuine, and the collaboration he'd described could provide exactly the kind of steady income stream that would allow me to take on more ambitious creative projects. The next morning, Christmas Day, I slept late and spent the afternoon in comfortable solitude, working on a personal project that had nothing to do with commissions or deadlines. A pair of silver earrings inspired by the frost patterns I'd noticed on my studio windows, designed purely for the pleasure of creating something beautiful without any external expectations or requirements. This was the luxury of working for myself, the ability to choose projects that fed my soul alongside the ones that paid my bills. I was shaping the second earring when my phone buzzed with a text from Tessa. "Merry Christmas. Hope dinner with the in-laws went well. Call when you have time. I have updates about the Morrison wedding and something else you need to know." Something else you need to know. The phrase carried enough weight to make me set down my tools and call her immediately. "Hey," Tessa answered on the first ring. "How was Christmas Eve with Marcus's parents?" "Actually really nice. They're lovely people, and Marcus has some interesting business ideas." "What's the something else I need to know?" I'm not sure how to say this, so I'm just going to say it. "I heard something yesterday that I think you should be aware of, but I want to be careful not to spread rumors or cause problems where there might not be any." My stomach tightened. Tessa wasn't dramatic or prone to gossip, which meant whatever she'd heard was significant enough to warrant this careful preface. "What kind of something?" "I was at the Morrison venue doing final walkthrough stuff yesterday, and I overheard a conversation between the venue coordinator and someone from a marketing company. They were talking about a jewelry vendor for corporate events, and I heard your name mentioned. Not in a good way." The frost patterns on my earrings suddenly seemed less important than whatever conversation Tessa had accidentally witnessed. "What exactly did you hear?" The marketing person was saying something about how local artisans were unreliable for corporate work, using you as an example of someone who'd refused to help with an important client event. "They made it sound like you were difficult to work with and not professional enough for serious business partnerships." I felt something cold settle in my chest, a recognition that went beyond simple disappointment. "Did you catch the name of the marketing company?" "Caldwell Creative Solutions." The pieces clicked together with the kind of clarity that feels both obvious and impossible. Brooke's emergency request for corporate gifts. Marcus's immediate follow-up with a business collaboration proposal. The convenient client emergency during Christmas Eve dinner. And now my reputation being presented as an example of unreliable local artisans, despite the fact that I'd been nothing but professional in explaining why I couldn't accommodate a last-minute request. "Tessa," I said slowly, "I think I'm about to have a very different kind of New Year than I was planning." The week between Christmas and New Year's had always been my favorite time to work. Most of Portland moved at a slower pace. Clients were traveling or recovering from holiday celebrations, and my studio became a sanctuary of focused creativity without the usual interruptions of consultations and phone calls. This year, however, the quiet felt different, charged with the kind of energy that comes when you realize someone has been playing a game you didn't know existed. I spent December 26th researching Caldwell Creative Solutions, diving deep into their client list, their marketing approach, and the kind of corporate events they specialized in organizing. What I found painted a picture of a successful agency built on relationships with mid-tier companies that wanted to appear more sophisticated than their budgets typically allowed. Marcus had built his reputation on delivering premium experiences at reasonable costs, which explained his interest in local artisans who could provide custom elements without the overhead of established luxury brands. Their website featured case studies of successful campaigns, client testimonials praising their attention to detail, and a portfolio of events that looked polished and professional. Nothing suggested they were anything other than a legitimate marketing agency building a solid regional reputation. But buried in the details, I began to notice patterns that felt familiar from my own business development struggles. Several of their featured case studies involved partnerships with local creators. A chocolatier who'd provided custom treats for a tech company's product launch. A ceramicist who'd created branded serving pieces for a restaurant group's anniversary celebration. A leather worker who'd designed executive gifts for a law firm's client appreciation event. In each case, the artisan was presented as a discovery of Caldwell Creative Solutions, with Marcus positioned as the visionary who'd recognized their potential and integrated their work into larger marketing strategies. The language was subtle but consistent. The artisans were described as raw talent that Caldwell had refined for corporate applications, or local creators who'd been elevated to professional standards through Marcus's guide. Each partnership seemed to follow a similar trajectory: initial collaboration, growing dependency on Caldwell's corporate connections, eventual integration into their standard service offering. I called the chocolatier Sarah Chen, whose custom corporate gifts had been featured prominently in 3 different Caldwell case studies. She answered on the second ring with the slightly harried tone of someone managing holiday orders, while probably dealing with equipment that chose the worst possible moments to malfunction. Sarah Chen Chocolates, this is Sarah. Hi Sarah. This is Zara Novak from Meridian Design. I'm a jewelry designer here in Portland, and I'm hoping you might have a few minutes to talk about your experience working with Caldwell Creative Solutions. There was a pause long enough for me to wonder if she was going to hang up, then a sigh that carried more weight than seemed reasonable for a simple business inquiry. Marcus Caldwell, she said, and something in her tone made me sit up straight. Yes, he's approached me about potential collaboration opportunities, and I wanted to get a sense of what working with them has been like for other local artisans. Can I ask why you're interested in working with them? Do you have other corporate clients, or would this be your first venture into that market? The question felt loaded with meaning I couldn't quite decode. I do mostly custom commissioned work, engagement rings, anniversary pieces, that sort of thing. This would be my first significant corporate partnership. Another pause, then Sarah's voice became more direct. Are you sitting down? Because I'm about to tell you some things that might change how you think about that partnership. For the next 45 minutes, Sarah Chen told me a story that felt like looking into a funhouse mirror version of my own business journey. She'd started her chocolate company 8 years ago, building a reputation for artisanal truffles and custom confections that attracted clients throughout the Pacific Northwest. Like me, she'd prioritized quality over quantity, developing relationships with individual customers who valued craftsmanship and personal service. 3 years ago, Marcus had approached her with what seemed like an incredible opportunity. A large tech company wanted custom chocolate gifts for their annual client appreciation event. 500 boxes of artisanal truffles, each personalized with the recipient's initials and the company's logo. The order was worth more than Sarah typically made in 2 months, and Marcus positioned himself as the intermediary who'd make the corporate world accessible to her artisanal approach. The project had gone beautifully. Sarah created exactly what was requested, delivered on time and within budget, and received glowing feedback from both the tech company and their client. Marcus had been thrilled, immediately proposing additional collaborations and promising to position her as Caldwell's preferred confection partner for all their corporate events. At first it felt like winning the lottery, Sarah explained. Steady corporate work meant I could plan ahead, invest in better equipment, maybe even hire an assistant. Marcus made it seem like he was opening doors that would never have been available to me otherwise, but the relationship had evolved in ways that gradually shifted the balance of power. Marcus began presenting Sarah's chocolates as a Caldwell service, rather than a collaboration with an independent artisan. Client contracts ran through his agency, which meant Sarah never developed direct relationships with the companies she was serving. When clients wanted to reorder or modify future projects, they contacted Marcus, not Sarah. The money was good, she continued, but I realized I was becoming a subcontractor instead of a business owner. Marcus controlled the client relationships, set the pricing, determined the project scope. I was just the person who actually made the chocolates. The arrangement had worked until it didn't. 6 months ago, one of Caldwell's biggest clients had requested a rush order, that would require Zara to work through a weekend and delay 2 of her regular custom orders. When she'd explained that the timeline wasn't feasible without compromising quality, Marcus had been understanding and apologetic. 2 weeks later, Zara discovered that Marcus had found another chocolatier willing to take on the rush project. Not only had he replaced her for that specific order, but he'd positioned the new chocolatier as Caldwell's primary confection partner going forward. Zara's ongoing relationship with 3 corporate clients had ended without warning, and her revenue had dropped by 60% almost overnight. The worst part, Zara said, wasn't losing the corporate work. It was realizing that Marcus had been presenting my situation to potential clients as an example of why they needed his agency to manage artisan partnerships. He was telling people that individual creators were unreliable and unprofessional, using my request for reasonable timelines as proof that artisans couldn't handle corporate demands. I felt my chest tighten as Zara's story confirmed what Tessa had overheard at the Morrison venue. Marcus wasn't just building his business by incorporating local artisans. He was systematically creating a narrative that positioned independent creators as talented but unreliable, while establishing his agency as the necessary intermediary that made their work suitable for professional applications. Zara, can I ask you something that might sound strange? Have you ever had any interactions with Brooke Caldwell, Marcus's wife? The real estate agent? Not directly, but she was at some of the corporate events where my chocolates were served. Why? I'm trying to understand whether this is purely business strategy, or if there might be more personal motivations involved. Zara was quiet for a moment, then spoke more carefully. I don't know about personal motivations, but I can tell you that Marcus seems to enjoy the process of identifying successful artisans, and then demonstrating how much more successful they could be with his guidance. There's something almost predatory about it, like he gets satisfaction from proving that creative people can't really handle business on their own. After we hung up, I sat in my studio staring at the notes I'd taken during our conversation. Zara's experience followed a clear pattern: initial opportunity, growing dependency, eventual replacement, followed by reputation damage that made independent work more difficult. It was a business model disguised as mentorship, designed to extract value from artisans, while gradually undermining their ability to work independently. I called 2 other creators whose names I'd found in Caldwell's case study. The ceramicist David Park had gone through an almost identical experience, losing 3 major corporate clients when he'd been unable to accommodate a last-minute change in specification. The leather worker, Maria Santos, was still working with Caldwell, but described feeling trapped in a relationship that had evolved far beyond what she'd originally agreed to. I'm making good money, Maria explained, but I feel like I'm working for Marcus instead of with him. He decides which projects I take on, sets the delivery schedules, even influences the design elements. It's steady work, but it doesn't feel like my business anymore. By the afternoon, I had enough information to understand that Marcus's approach to my sister's request had been strategic rather than spontaneous. Brooke's demand for last-minute corporate gifts had been designed to create exactly the situation that would allow Marcus to position me as an example of unreliable artisan behavior. My professional refusal had become the foundation for a narrative that would justify his agency as necessary for managing creative partnerships. The realization brought clarity, but also a cold anger that felt different from anything I'd experienced in my business career. This wasn't about competition or different approaches to building success. This was about deliberately undermining independent creators in order to build an empire on their diminished reputation. I spent the next 2 days researching everything I could about Caldwell Creative Solutions, diving into public records, business registrations, and financial filings that painted a picture of their actual business model. What I discovered was more complex and troubling than even Zara's story had suggested. Marcus hadn't just built his agency by incorporating local artisans, he'd systematically identified successful independent creators and developed strategies for making them dependent on his corporate connection. The pattern was consistent across multiple partnerships, always beginning with an attractive opportunity and evolving into relationships where the artisan's independence was gradually eroded. But the most revealing information came from a different source entirely. My search through Portland business records had led me to incorporation documents, partnership agreements, and financial statements that were matters of public record. Caldwell Creative Solutions had been growing rapidly, but their expansion was funded through a series of strategic partnerships and investments that created some interesting ownership structures. One name kept appearing in the financial documents: Zara Novak. I stared at the paperwork spread across my kitchen table, trying to process what I was seeing. My mother owned a 15% stake in Caldwell Creative Solutions, acquired through what the documents described as a strategic family investment, made 18 months ago. The investment had been substantial enough to fund Marcus's expansion into the Artisan Partnership Program that had targeted creators like Sarah Chen. My mother had never mentioned investing in Marcus's business. More significantly, she'd never mentioned it during our Christmas Eve dinner when Marcus was describing his interest in collaborating with local artisans. She'd sat there listening to him outline partnership opportunities with her own daughter while having a financial stake in the very business model that was designed to undermine independent creators. I called my mother's cell phone, but it went straight to voicemail. I tried the house phone with the same result. Either they were out for the evening, or they were screening calls, which seemed increasingly likely given what I'd discovered about the family business connections I'd never been told about. Instead, I drafted a careful email asking if we could meet for coffee to discuss some business questions I had. Nothing accusatory, nothing that would put her on the defensive, just a daughter seeking advice from a parent with business experience. I hit send and tried to focus on the custom projects that still required my attention, but concentration felt impossible when everything I thought I understood about my family dynamics was being rewritten. My phone rang around 8 p.m. Brooke's number. "Zara, Mom said you wanted to talk to her about business stuff. Is everything okay?" I hesitated, trying to decide how much to reveal and how quickly. "I'm just doing some research about potential collaborations and wanted to get her perspective on a few things. With Marcus's agents." "That's so exciting. I told you he was serious about working with local artisans. This could be exactly what your business needs to really take off." The enthusiasm in her voice felt both genuine and calculated, like she was reading from a script she'd rehearsed but still believed in. I wondered how much she knew about her husband's business model, whether she understood the pattern of dependency and replacement that seemed to define his artisan partnerships. "Brooke, can I ask you something? How long has Mom been involved with Marcus's business?" There was a pause long enough for me to know the question had hit something important. "What do you mean involved?" "I mean financially. As an investor." Another pause, then Brooke's voice became more careful. "I think you should talk to Mom about her investment decisions. That's not really my area." "But you knew about it." "Zara, families help each other succeed. When Marcus needed capital to expand, Mom recognized a good opportunity and decided to support his vision. It's not complicated. Families help each other succeed." The phrase echoed with all the weight of the Christmas Eve conversation about being social and making good impressions. Mom's investment in Marcus's business hadn't been mentioned because it would have complicated the narrative of him independently, recognizing my potential and offering unsolicited collaboration opportunities. "Did you know about his artisan partnership program when you asked me to make corporate gifts for his client event?" "What do you mean?" "I mean, did you know that he systematically approaches local creators, builds their dependency on corporate work through his agency, and then replaces them while using their refusal of unreasonable requests as evidence that artisans are unreliable?" The silence stretched long enough for me to hear traffic in the background, suggesting Brooke was in her car, probably driving home from showing houses to clients who trusted her to represent their interests honestly. "Zara," she said finally, "I think you're misunderstanding Marcus's business model. He creates opportunities for artists who wouldn't otherwise have access to corporate clients. If some partnerships don't work out, that's just normal business evolution. And the fact that he's now telling potential clients that I'm an example of an unreliable artisan who can't handle professional demands. I don't know anything about that." But her tone suggested she knew exactly what I was talking about, which meant either Marcus had discussed his strategy with her, or she'd been more involved in creating the situation than her Christmas Eve emergency had suggested. "Brooke, I need you to understand something. My business is built on reputation and relationships that I've spent 5 years developing. If Marcus is using my refusal to accommodate a last-minute request as an example of artisan unreliability, that could seriously damage my ability to work independently." Maybe independence isn't as important as you think it is. Maybe working with people who understand business could actually help you grow beyond what you could achieve on your own. The conversation ended shortly after that, with promises to continue discussing things after the holidays and expressions of hope that we could find a way forward that worked for everyone. But the underlying message was clear. My family saw Marcus's business model as a solution to problems I didn't know I had, and my resistance to that solution was being framed as stubborn attachment to an independence that was holding me back. I spent New Year's Eve alone in my studio, working on the personal silver earrings that had been interrupted by Christmas preparations and family revelation. The frost patterns that had inspired the design seemed appropriate for the cold clarity that was settling over my understanding of the situation I was facing. Marcus's interest in collaboration wasn't about recognizing my talent or creating mutually beneficial partnerships. It was about incorporating my work into his business model in a way that would gradually make me dependent on his corporate connections while positioning him as the professional face of artisan services. The fact that my mother had invested in his agency, and that my sister had participated in creating the very situation that would demonstrate my alleged unreliability, suggested a level of family coordination that felt like betrayal. But it also suggested something else. If they'd gone to this much trouble to create a narrative about my professional limitations, it meant they considered my independent success threatening enough to require systematic undermining. They weren't trying to help me grow. They were trying to control my growth in ways that served their interests rather than mine. The earrings were nearly finished when my phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. "This is Patricia Caldwell. I hope it's not too late to reach out. Could we meet for coffee sometime this week? There are some things about the family businesses that I think you should know." I stared at the message, trying to decode what Marcus's mother might want to discuss and why she felt the need to contact me directly rather than going through her son or daughter-in-law. The phrase family businesses suggested she understood more about the interconnected financial relationships than had been apparent during Christmas Eve dinner. I typed back a response agreeing to meet, then returned to the final details of the earrings that would be my last purely creative project before diving into whatever business warfare was about to consume my winter. The coffee shop Patricia had suggested was in Northwest Portland, far enough from both our neighborhoods to feel neutral but close enough to the Pearl District that I could stop by my studio afterward. I arrived early, partly from nerves and partly from curiosity about what Marcus's mother might want to discuss outside the presence of her son and daughter-in-law. Patricia was already there when I walked in, sitting at a corner table with a clear view of the entrance and holding a ceramic mug in both hands, like she was warming herself against more than just the January cold. She looked elegant but tired, wearing a wool coat that spoke of quality without ostentation, and carrying herself with the kind of composure that comes from years of navigating complicated family dynamics. "Zara, thank you for meeting. I wasn't sure you'd be willing to talk given the circumstances." I settled into the chair across from her, trying to read what circumstances she was referring to. "I was curious about what you wanted to discuss, my son's business practices," she said without preamble, "and your family's involvement in them." For the next hour, Patricia told me a story that filled in the gaps between everything I'd discovered through my own research and everything I'd suspected but couldn't prove. Marcus's business model wasn't just opportunistic, it was predatory by design, developed through years of studying how to identify and exploit the vulnerabilities of creative entrepreneurs. The Artisan Partnership Program had evolved from Marcus's early recognition that independent creators possessed valuable skills but often lacked business development expertise. Rather than helping them build that expertise, he designed a system that made their lack of business sophistication profitable for his agency. At first I thought it was clever, Patricia admitted. He was creating opportunities for artists while building a unique service offering for his corporate clients. But as I watched how these partnerships developed, I realized that Marcus wasn't just providing business services, he was systematically making these creators dependent on him in ways that ultimately served his interests rather than theirs. The dependency wasn't accidental. Marcus had studied how to identify successful artisans who were reaching the limits of what they could achieve independently, then position himself as the solution to growth challenges they didn't necessarily need to solve through his agency. The initial opportunities were always substantial enough to seem transformative, designed to make the artisan grateful and eager to continue the relationship. But the real genius of his approach, Patricia continued, was understanding that most creative people prioritize their craft over business development. They don't want to spend time learning about corporate sales cycles or relationship management. Marcus exploited that preference by making himself indispensable to their financial success. The pattern Sarah Chen had described was intentional rather than accidental. Marcus identified successful artisans, created dependency through attractive corporate opportunities, then systematically replaced them while ensuring that their departure damaged their reputation for future independent work. The replacement wasn't the goal. It was the natural evolution of a system designed to extract maximum value from creative talent while minimizing the compensation required. Your mother's investment, Patricia said carefully, wasn't just about supporting Marcus's business expansion. It was about funding a specific strategy to approach you in a way that would seem like family support rather than business predation. The coffee in my mug had gone cold while I listened, but I continued holding it for the warmth and the sense of having something stable to anchor myself to while my understanding of the past 6 months was completely reconstructed. My mother knew what he was planning. Your mother knew that Marcus saw your business as an acquisition opportunity rather than a collaboration prospect. The investment was structured to give her a stake in the profits generated by incorporating your work into his agency's service offering. Zara Novak had bet against her own daughter's independence, investing money in a business model designed to undermine exactly the kind of creative entrepreneurship I represented. The Christmas Eve dinner hadn't been about family bonding or making good impressions on new relatives. It had been about positioning me for a business strategy that would benefit everyone except me. Why are you telling me this? I asked. Patricia was quiet for a moment, looking out the window at the January rain that seemed to define Portland winters. When she spoke, her voice carried the weight of someone who'd been wrestling with a decision for longer than our conversation had lasted. Because I've watched my son build his business by convincing talented people that their independence is a limitation rather than an asset. And because your family's willingness to participate in that process suggests they don't understand what you've actually accomplished on your own. She reached into her purse and pulled out a folder thick enough to suggest extensive documentation. These are copies of all the partnership agreements Marcus has signed with artisans over the past 3 years, along with financial records showing how those relationships evolved and ultimately ended. You'll also find documentation of your mother's investment terms and the specific provisions related to incorporating your work into Caldwell's service offerings. I accepted the folder, feeling its weight as both information and responsibility. There's something else, Patricia continued. Marcus doesn't know that I disagree with his business model, and he certainly doesn't know that I've been documenting his practices. If you decide to use this information, it needs to appear that you discovered it through your own research. The rain was getting heavier, turning the coffee shop windows into rivers of distortion that made the outside world seem uncertain and fluid. I thought about Sarah Chen working longer hours for less money, about David Park losing corporate clients he'd never actually owned, about Maria Santos feeling trapped in a relationship that had evolved beyond recognition. What would you do if you were me? Patricia smiled for the first time during our conversation, and I could see the family resemblance to Marcus in the shape of her eyes and the determined set of her jaw. I'd remember that successful predators depend on their prey not understanding the game being played. Once you understand the rules, you can change them. Patricia's folder sat on my kitchen table for 3 days before I opened it, thick with documentation that would either confirm my worst suspicions or reveal that I'd been constructing conspiracies from coincidence. The weight of it seemed to change depending on my mood, sometimes heavy with potential justice, sometimes light with the possibility that I was overreacting to normal business competition. But every time I walked past it, I remembered the careful way Patricia had chosen her words, the deliberate precision of someone who'd spent months documenting behavior she couldn't openly oppose. When I finally spread the contents across my dining room table, the scope of Marcus's strategy became clear in ways that made my own situation feel both more serious and more manageable. The partnership agreements followed identical patterns, always beginning with language about mutual benefit and collaborative growth, then evolving through amendments that gradually shifted control toward Caldwell Creative Solutions. By the final versions, the artisans had become subcontractors with limited rights and no direct client relationships. Sarah Chen's experience hadn't been unique. It was the template. Marcus had refined his approach through dozens of partnerships, learning how to identify the precise moment when dependency had been established and replacement could occur without legal consequence. The documentation showed a business model built on systematic exploitation, disguised as mentorship and opportunity creation. The financial records were even more revealing. My mother's investment hadn't been passive support for a family member's business venture. She'd purchased a stake in the artisan acquisition program specifically, with returns tied directly to the successful incorporation of independent creators into Caldwell's service offering. The contract included performance bonuses based on the number of artisans converted from independent partnerships to subcontractor relationships within specific timeframes. Zara Novak had literally invested in the destruction of businesses like mine. The documentation included email exchanges between Marcus and my mother discussing target acquisition strategies, with my name appearing in multiple messages as a high-value opportunity, requiring careful approach coordination with family stakeholders. They'd been planning to incorporate my business for over a year, using family gatherings to gather intelligence about my client base, financial situation, and potential vulnerability. Christmas Eve dinner hadn't been about getting to know Marcus's parents. It had been a final assessment meeting to confirm that their strategy was ready for implementation. I photographed every document, uploaded the images to encrypted cloud storage, and created multiple backup copies before returning the originals to Patricia's folder. Whatever I decided to do with this information, I needed to ensure it couldn't disappear if Marcus discovered his mother's betrayal. The evidence painted a picture of systematic fraud disguised as business development, and that kind of documentation could destroy more than just family relationships. My phone had been ringing intermittently for days with calls from Marcus, my mother, and Brooke, but I'd been letting everything go to voicemail while I processed the full scope of what I'd discovered. The messages followed a predictable pattern of concern escalating to mild irritation, with Marcus wondering if we could schedule our collaboration discussion and my family asking if I was feeling well since I hadn't been returning calls. The performance felt choreographed now that I understood the coordination involved. They were maintaining the illusion of independent concern while actually implementing a strategy designed to pressure me into engaging before I had time to fully understand what was being offered. The missed calls weren't about family worry. They were about maintaining timeline control for a business acquisition that had been planned for months. I finally called Tessa, the only person I trusted to help me think through the implications of what I'd learned without immediately advising me to either forgive my family or burn everything down in righteous fury. "I need to show you something," I said when she answered. "Are you free this evening?" Define free. I have 3 brides having simultaneous meltdowns about January wedding weather, but nothing that can't wait if you sound this serious. I sound serious because this is serious. Can you come over around 7? Tessa arrived with Thai takeout and the kind of focused attention that meant she'd rearranged her entire evening to be present for whatever crisis required documentation review. I spread Patricia's evidence across my living room floor, walking her through the timeline of Marcus's business model and my family's involvement in targeting my independence. "Holy shit," she said after reading through the partnership agreements. "This isn't just unethical business practice, this is fraud. He's systematically lying to artisans about the nature of the relationships he's offering." "It gets worse," I said, handing her the financial documents that detailed my mother's investment terms. Tessa read in silence for several minutes, occasionally shaking her head or making small sounds of disbelief. When she finished, she looked up with the expression of someone who'd just witnessed a car accident and was trying to process whether anyone had survived. "Zara, your mother bet against you. She literally invested money in a business model designed to destroy your independence and make her profit from your failure to maintain control of your own work." "I know. No, I don't think you do know. This isn't family drama about different visions for your success. This is financial predation with your own relatives as co-conspirators. They're not trying to help you grow. They're trying to harvest you." Tessa's bluntness cut through the emotional confusion that had been clouding my thinking for days. The evidence wasn't ambiguous, and the family relationships I'd been trying to preserve had already been sacrificed by people who saw my business as an asset to be acquired rather than an achievement to be respected. "What would you do?" I'd make sure they understood that harvesting me was going to be a lot more expensive than they'd budgeted for." "Meaning what? Specifically?" Tessa was quiet for a moment, studying the documents spread across my floor with the kind of strategic thinking that made her excellent at managing complex weddings where multiple vendors and family dynamics had to be coordinated without disaster. Meaning Marcus's business model only works if the artisans don't understand what's happening to them. He depends on people being grateful for opportunities and trusting that family members have their best interests at heart. But you're not grateful, and you don't trust them, and you have documentation of exactly how their system works. So I expose him. So you make him irrelevant. Tessa pulled out her laptop and opened a search window, typing in queries that hadn't occurred to me during my own research. Within minutes, she'd found information that reframed everything I thought I understood about the power dynamics I was facing. Caldwell Creative Solutions had been aggressively expanding, but their growth was built on debt financing and partnership agreements that created ongoing obligations rather than sustainable revenue streams. Marcus's business model required constant acquisition of new artisans to replace the ones he systematically burned through, and the artisan acquisition program represented a significant percentage of their projected revenue growth. "Look at this," Tessa said, pointing to a financial analysis that showed Caldwell's debt-to-equity ratios. "They're leveraged way beyond what's sustainable for a service business. Marcus needs those artisan partnerships to work because he's borrowed against projected revenues that depend on successful acquisitions." The documentation Patricia had provided suddenly looked different. Marcus wasn't just exploiting artisans for additional profit. He was doing it because his business model required their contributions to remain financially viable. My refusal to participate wouldn't just cost him one potential partnership, it could trigger a cascade of financial problems that threatened his entire agency. "And look at this," Tessa continued, pulling up another document. "Your mother's investment included personal guarantees against Marcus's business loans. If Caldwell fails to meet revenue projections, she's not just losing her investment, she's liable for additional loss." Zara Novak hadn't just bet against her daughter's independence. She'd secured that bet with personal assets that could be seized if Marcus's acquisition strategy failed to generate the projected return. "Tessa," I said slowly, "what happens if instead of trying to expose Marcus's business model, I just make sure it stops working?" "You mean make him fail to acquire the artisans he needs to meet his revenue projection?" "I mean I make sure every independent creator in Portland understands exactly what kind of partnerships he's offering and what the long-term consequences of those relationships actually look like." The idea was taking shape as I spoke it, evolving from reactive defense to proactive strategy. Marcus's business model depended on information asymmetry, artisans not understanding the true nature of the relationships they were entering. But if that information became widely available, if every successful independent creator in the city understood what Caldwell Creative Solutions actually offered, the acquisition program would collapse. "That's not revenge," Tessa said, smiling with the kind of anticipation that meant she was already thinking through implementation details. "That's market correction." "What do you mean?" "I mean Marcus has been successful because he's exploiting artisans who don't have access to information about his track record with other creators. But if that information becomes public knowledge, if every artisan in Portland understands what happened to Sarah Chen and David Park and Maria Santos, then his business model becomes unworkable. Then his revenue projections fail, his loans get called, and your mother loses not just her investment, but potentially a lot more depending on what personal guarantees she signed." The strategy felt both elegant and devastating. Instead of trying to prove wrongdoing or seek external justice, I could simply ensure that Marcus's future victims had the information they needed to make informed decisions about partnership opportunity. The market would correct itself once the information asymmetry was eliminated, and the financial consequences would fall naturally on the people who'd designed the predatory system. "Tessa, how many independent artisans do you work with through your wedding planning business?" "Direct, maybe 20 or 30 on a regular basis, but if you include the broader network of creators I know through events and referrals, probably a couple hundred throughout Oregon and Washington, and they trust your judgment about business relationships." "They trust my judgment about everything business related. I've been referring clients to them for years, and I've never steered anyone toward a partnership that didn't work out well for everyone involved." Would you be willing to help me make sure they all understand what Marcus's partnership offers actually involve? Tessa closed her laptop and looked at me with the expression of someone who'd just been invited to participate in something that would require careful planning but offer tremendous satisfaction. Zara, I've been watching Marcus Caldwell position himself as the savior of local artisans for 3 years, knowing that something felt wrong about his approach but not having enough information to warn people effectively. You just handed me everything I need to make sure his next acquisition attempt fails before it begins. We spent the next 4 hours developing a communication strategy that would disseminate information about Marcus's business model without appearing vindictive or legally problematic. The goal wasn't to destroy his agency but to ensure that future artisan partnerships were truly voluntary, based on accurate information about what those relationships would actually involve. Tessa had contacts throughout the Pacific Northwest creative community, wedding vendors, event planners, gallery owners, and craft fair organizers who regularly interacted with independent artisans. Each of these people had professional reasons to care about the well-being of creators in their networks, and most had already heard Marcus's name in connection with artisan partnerships that had ended unsuccessfully. The information would be shared as professional education rather than personal attack. Sarah Chen, David Park, and Maria Santos had already agreed to discuss their experiences publicly, and Patricia's documentation provided the business context that explained why individual partnership failures reflected systematic problems rather than isolated misunderstandings. The beauty of this approach, Tessa explained, is that we're not asking anyone to take action against Marcus, we're just making sure they have accurate information about what his partnerships involve. If artisans choose not to work with him based on that information, that's their informed business decision. And if enough artisans make that decision, then Marcus can't meet his acquisition targets, his revenue projections fail, and the financial consequences follow naturally from his own business choices. The plan felt both comprehensive and ethical. We weren't trying to harm Marcus's business through sabotage or misinformation. We were simply ensuring that the creative community had access to information that would allow them to make educated decisions about partnership opportunity. If his business model couldn't survive transparency, that was a problem with the model, rather than with the transparency. But there was still the question of my family's involvement, and how to handle relationships that had been permanently altered by the discovery of their coordinated betrayal. Patricia's documentation proved that my mother, Brooke, and Marcus had been planning to acquire my business for over a year, using family gatherings to assess my vulnerabilities and time their approach for maximum effectiveness. What do I do about the family relationships? I asked Tessa. What do you want to do about them? I want to understand why my mother invested in a business model designed to destroy my independence, and I want to know if Brooke understood what she was participating in when she made that emergency request for corporate gifts. And then I don't know. Part of me wants to confront them directly, make them explain why they thought this was acceptable, but another part of me thinks that understanding their motivations won't change anything about what they actually did. Tessa was quiet for a moment, gathering the documentation into neat piles while she considered the question. I think, she said finally, that confronting them directly gives them the opportunity to control the narrative and potentially interfere with your information campaign. But if you wait until after the creative community understands what Marcus's partnerships actually involve, then any conversation you have with your family happens from a position of strength, rather than vulnerability. You mean wait until his business model fails? I mean wait until it's clear that his business model is going to fail regardless of what they do to try to salvage it. Once Marcus can't acquire new artisans, once his revenue projections are obviously unworkable, once your mother's investment is clearly lost, then they have to deal with the consequences of their choices without being able to blame your refusal to cooperate. The strategy made sense on multiple levels. Confronting my family now would alert them to what I'd discovered and potentially give them time to develop countermeasures or modify their approach. But if I waited until their strategy had already failed due to market forces they couldn't control, any conversation we had would focus on consequences rather than prevention. How long do you think it would take for the information to circulate effectively through the creative community? I asked, with the networks I have access to, maybe 6 weeks to reach everyone who's likely to be targeted by Marcus's acquisition program, maybe another few weeks for the information to fully impact his ability to develop new partnerships. So, by March, his artisan acquisition program would be effectively dead. By March, every successful independent creator in the Pacific Northwest would understand exactly what Marcus Caldwell's partnership offers actually involve. What they choose to do with that information is up to them. We finalized the communication plan, with Tessa taking responsibility for reaching her network of wedding and event professionals, while I focused on direct outreach to artisans who'd been approached by Marcus, but hadn't yet committed to partnership. The information would be shared as professional education about contract terms and business relationship red flags, with specific examples drawn from documented experiences rather than personal accusation. The approach felt both more sophisticated and more devastating than direct confrontation would have been. Instead of trying to prove that Marcus was exploiting artisans, we were simply making sure that future targets understood what his partnerships actually involved. The market would correct itself once the information asymmetry was eliminated, and the financial consequences would follow naturally from business choices rather than external attack. By the time Tessa left that evening, I had a clear sense of what the next 2 months would involve, and a timeline for when I could expect to see results. The information campaign would begin immediately, with Sarah Chen, David Park and Maria Santos sharing their experiences through professional networks and social media platforms. Within weeks, every artisan in Portland would understand what Caldwell Creative Solutions partnerships actually offered, and Marcus's ability to acquire new creators would be severely limited. The financial pressure would build gradually as his acquisition targets failed to materialize, and his revenue projections became obviously unworkable. By early March, the debt financing that had enabled his expansion would become problematic, and the personal guarantees my mother had signed would start to look like serious financial liability. That would be the moment to have conversations about family relationships and business ethics, when the consequences of their choices were clear and irreversible, and when my own position was secure regardless of what they decided to do about the wreckage of their coordination. I spent the following morning in my studio, working on commissions that would be completed and paid for regardless of what happened to Marcus's business model. The silver earrings inspired by frost patterns were nearly finished, requiring only final polishing and the installation of ear wires that would make them functional as well as beautiful. The work felt meditative in a way that helped me process the emotional complexity of what I was about to set in motion. My phone buzzed with a text from Marcus. "Hi Zara, I hope you're doing well. I'd love to schedule that collaboration discussion we talked about. Are you available for coffee this week?" I stared at the message for several minutes, thinking about the partnership agreements Patricia had documented and the revenue projections that depended on my cooperation. Marcus needed me more than I needed him, and his timeline for acquisition was probably driven by financial pressures I was only beginning to understand. I typed back a brief response. "Things are busy with January commissions, but I should have time to meet in a few weeks. I'll let you know when my schedule opens up." It wasn't a lie. January was always busy with custom work from clients who'd received jewelry gift certificates over the holiday, but it also bought me time to let the information campaign develop momentum before Marcus realized that his acquisition strategy was facing systematic resistance from an informed creative community. 2 weeks later, the effects were already visible. Sarah Chen called to tell me that 3 artisans had contacted her directly after hearing about her experience with Caldwell Creative Solutions, asking for details about the partnership evolution she'd described. David Park had been approached by a ceramicist who'd been considering Marcus's collaboration offer, and wanted to understand why the relationship had ended unsuccessfully. Maria Santos had decided to terminate her ongoing partnership with Caldwell despite the financial impact of losing steady corporate work. "I realized I was working for Marcus instead of with him," she explained when she called to thank me for making the information available. "Your friend Tessa was right. I was being harvested instead of helped." The information was spreading through professional networks exactly as Tessa had predicted, with artisans sharing details about partnership terms and business relationship warning signs. Marcus's name was becoming associated with caution rather than opportunity, and his ability to develop new acquisitions was diminishing as potential targets learned about the experiences of previous partners. By the end of January, 3 different artisans had contacted me to ask if I knew anything about Caldwell Creative Solutions, having been approached by Marcus with partnership offers that sounded familiar based on information they'd received through professional networks. Each conversation confirmed that the information campaign was working. Potential targets were now informed about what Marcus's partnerships actually involved, and they were making decisions based on accurate, rather than incomplete information. The financial pressure was building exactly as Tessa had predicted. Marcus's acquisition timeline was falling behind projections, and his revenue estimates were becoming obviously unworkable as informed artisans declined partnership opportunities they now understood would undermine their independence. It was time to let him know that his collaboration offer was no longer of interest to me, and that the window for any kind of partnership had closed permanently. The call came at 7:30 on a Tuesday morning in early February, while I was setting stones into an anniversary ring that would mark 30 years of marriage for a couple who'd met at a Portland coffee shop that no longer existed. My phone vibrated against the workbench with a number I didn't recognize, but something about the timing felt urgent enough to answer. Zara Novak. This is Jennifer Walsh from Pacific Northwest Business Journal. I'm working on a story about predatory business practices in the creative services industry, and your name has come up in connection with some concerning patterns we've been investigating. Do you have a few minutes to talk? I set down my tools carefully, processing the implications of a business journalist calling about predatory practices in creative services. The information campaign Tessa and I had orchestrated was supposed to flow through professional networks and personal conversations, not attract media attention that could escalate the situation beyond our control. What kind of patterns are you investigating? We've received reports about a local marketing agency that's been systematically targeting independent artisans with partnership offers that appear to be designed to acquire their client bases and undermine their ability to work independently. Multiple sources have described a business model that involves creating dependency relationships that ultimately benefit the agency at the expense of the creators. The description was accurate but concerning. Media coverage could expose Marcus's practices more broadly, but it could also alert him to the coordinated nature of the information sharing that had been undermining his acquisition strategy. If he understood that his business model was facing systematic resistance, he might modify his approach or accelerate his timeline in ways that could create additional complications. I'm not sure I can provide the kind of information you're looking for, I said carefully. My experience with marketing agencies has been limited. Actually, we understand that Caldwell Creative Solutions has been specifically targeting you for a potential partnership and that you've declined their offer. We're hoping you might be willing to discuss what you learned about their business model during your evaluation process. The phrasing suggested that Jennifer Walsh had sources inside the creative community who understood more about the situation than a typical business journalist would know through casual reporting. Someone had provided her with specific information about Marcus's targeting of my business, which meant the information campaign had reached people with media connections who saw larger implications worth investigating. Can I ask who provided my name as someone to interview? I can't identify specific sources, but I can tell you that we've been contacted by multiple members of the creative community who are concerned about patterns they've observed in artisan partnerships throughout the region. Your situation has been mentioned as an example of successful resistance to questionable business practices. Successful resistance. The phrase suggested that my refusal to engage with Marcus's collaboration offers was being interpreted as strategic rather than simply personal preference. The information campaign had created a narrative about informed decision-making that positioned other artisans to resist similar approaches, but it had also attracted attention that could complicate the quiet market correction we'd been implementing. I'd need to think about whether media coverage is the right approach for addressing these concerns, I said. Can I get back to you in a day or two? Of course, but I should mention that we're planning to publish this story within the next week, with or without your participation. We have enough documented sources to establish the pattern of problematic practices, and your perspective would help us present a complete picture of how these business models affect successful independent creators. After we hung up, I sat in my studio, looking at the anniversary ring that represented 3 decades of commitment between two people who'd built their life together through trust and mutual support. The stones I'd been setting were sapphires chosen to match the color of the bride's eyes on their wedding day, a detail that required careful attention to hue and clarity, that wouldn't be obvious to casual observers but would be meaningful to the people who understood the story. The contrast between the patience required for quality craftsmanship and the urgency of responding to media inquiries felt like a metaphor for everything that had gone wrong with my family's approach to my business. They'd wanted quick results and dramatic changes, while I'd built something sustainable through attention to detail and long-term relationship building. I called Tessa, who answered with the harried tone of someone managing multiple wedding emergencies simultaneously. "Please tell me you're not calling with another family business conspiracy revelation," she said. "I'm dealing with 3 separate floral disasters and a venue that just discovered they double-booked their March Saturday. I just got a call from a business journalist who's investigating predatory practices in creative services." She specifically mentioned Caldwell Creative Solutions and asked to interview me about Marcus's targeting of my business. There was a pause long enough for me to hear Tessa typing rapidly, probably managing the venue crisis while processing what media coverage might mean for our information strategy. "Did she say how she learned about your situation?" Multiple sources in the creative community apparently. Someone positioned my refusal to work with Marcus as an example of successful resistance to questionable business practices, which means our information campaign worked better than we expected, Tessa said, and I could hear satisfaction in her voice despite the wedding chaos she was managing. People aren't just avoiding Marcus, they're understanding that avoiding him represents good business judgment. But media coverage could alert him to the fact that his acquisition problems are the result of coordinated information sharing rather than individual coincidence. Or it could accelerate his financial problems by making his business model publicly controversial before he has time to modify his approach. The point was valid but complicated. Media attention could destroy Marcus's ability to acquire artisans more quickly than market forces alone, but it could also create unpredictable consequences that affected everyone involved in the situation. My mother's investment and personal guarantees meant that Marcus's financial failure would have direct implications for my family's assets, regardless of how I felt about their coordination against my independence. "Tessa, what happens to my mother's financial exposure if Marcus's business fails publicly rather than quietly?" "Same financial consequences, but potentially more legal complications if the failure involves questions about fraudulent business practice. Media coverage could trigger regulatory investigation that makes everything more expensive and time-consuming to resolve." I spent the rest of the morning finishing the anniversary ring, using the familiar rhythm of careful work to think through the implications of media coverage versus continued quiet resistance. The information campaign had been designed to let market forces correct the information asymmetry that made Marcus's business model possible, but media attention could transform a market correction into a public scandal with consequences that extended far beyond the immediate participant. By noon, I'd decided that participating in the Business Journal story would accelerate outcomes I wanted while potentially creating complications I wasn't prepared to manage. But I also realized that declining to participate wouldn't prevent the story from being published, and my absence from the coverage might be interpreted as either lack of evidence or unwillingness to speak publicly about problematic business practices. I called Jennifer Walsh back and agreed to a brief interview, with the understanding that I would discuss general concerns about artisan partnership structures, rather than specific details about Marcus's approaches to my business. The goal was to contribute to public education about contract terms and business relationship warning signs, without appearing to coordinate a targeted campaign against Caldwell Creative Solutions. The interview took place that afternoon at a coffee shop in the Alberta Arts District, surrounded by the kind of creative energy that made Portland attractive to independent artisans and predatory business models alike. Jennifer Walsh was younger than I'd expected, probably in her early 30s, with the focused intensity of someone building a reputation through investigative work that established her expertise in business practices affecting creative community. "I appreciate you agreeing to talk," she said, setting up a digital recorder between us. I know this situation involves family relationships that make public discussion complicated. The comment suggested she knew more about my family's involvement than she'd indicated during our phone conversation, which meant her sources included people with detailed knowledge of the coordination between Marcus, Brooke, and my mother. Someone had provided information about the personal dynamics underlying the business, targeting, positioning the story as more than just questionable partnership practices. I'm happy to discuss general concerns about how partnership agreements can affect independent creators, I said carefully. I think it's important for artisans to understand what different types of business relationships actually involve. Can you walk me through what you learned about Caldwell Creative Solutions' approach to artisan partnership? For the next 45 minutes, I described the pattern of dependency creation that defined Marcus's business model, using the experiences of Sarah Chen, David Park, and Maria Santos as examples of how partnership agreements could evolve in ways that undermined artisan independence. I focused on contract terms and business relationship structures, rather than personal motivations, presenting the information as professional education rather than personal grievance. What made you decide not to pursue a partnership with Caldwell Creative Solutions, Jennifer? I realized that the partnership structure they were offering would require me to give up control over client relationships and project selection in exchange for access to corporate work that I could potentially develop independently. The trade-off didn't make sense for my business model or my long-term goals. And how did your family react to that decision? The question confirmed that Jennifer understood the family dynamics involved in Marcus's targeting of my business, which meant someone had provided her with information about my mother's investment, and Brooke's coordination of the initial contact attempt. The story was going to include details about family business relationships regardless of how much I chose to reveal during the interview. My family has different perspectives on business growth strategies, I said. We don't always agree about the best approaches to expanding successful ventures. We understand that your mother has a financial stake in Caldwell Creative Solutions, and that your sister coordinated some of the initial partnership discussions. How do you think those relationships affected the way the collaboration was presented to you? Jennifer Walsh had clearly done extensive research that went beyond interviewing disgruntled artisans about partnership experiences. Someone had provided her with information about my family's financial coordination, which meant the story would expose not just Marcus's business model but the personal relationships that had enabled his targeting of my business. I think it's important for any business owner to understand all the relationships and motivations involved when evaluating partnership opportunities, I said. Sometimes what appears to be an independent business proposal is actually part of a more complex set of interests and investments. The interview concluded with my agreement to be quoted discussing general concerns about artisan partnership agreements and the importance of understanding contract terms before committing to business relations. Jennifer assured me that the story would focus on business practices rather than personal family dynamics, but her questions had made it clear that she understood the coordination involved in Marcus's approach to my business. 3 days later, the Pacific Northwest Business Journal published a front-page story titled, "When Partnerships Become Predation: How Some Agencies Target Independent Creators." The article detailed Marcus's business model with enough specificity to make it clear that Caldwell Creative Solutions was the primary focus of investigation, while maintaining enough general language to avoid potential legal challenge. The story quoted Sarah Chen, David Park, and Maria Santos describing their experiences with partnership agreements that had evolved beyond their original understanding, with specific examples of how dependency relationships had been created and exploited. My quotes appeared in a section about informed decision-making, and the importance of understanding all relationships involved in business proposals, but the most damaging information came from sources Jennifer hadn't identified during our interview. The article included details about Marcus's debt financing structure, his acquisition timeline requirements, and the personal guarantees that made his business model financially unsustainable if artisan acquisitions failed to meet projected targets. Someone with access to Caldwell's financial records had provided information that exposed the underlying desperation driving Marcus's aggressive expansion strategy. The Business Journal story was picked up by Portland's Alternative Weekly and shared extensively through social media platforms that reached creative communities throughout the Pacific Northwest. Within days, Marcus's name was associated with cautionary advice about partnership agreements and business relationship red flags that made future acquisitions practically impossible. More significantly, the media coverage attracted attention from potential clients who questioned whether they wanted to work with an agency that had been publicly identified as exploiting local artists. Corporate customers began asking pointed questions about Caldwell's business practices and requesting assurance that their events and campaigns weren't supporting questionable partnership models. The financial pressure that had been building gradually through the information campaign accelerated dramatically as media coverage made Marcus's business model publicly controversial. Companies that had planned to work with Caldwell Creative Solutions postponed or canceled contracts while they evaluated whether the association aligned with their corporate value. Marcus's revenue projections collapsed within 2 weeks of the business journal story's publication, as both artisan acquisitions and corporate clients became unavailable due to reputation concerns that couldn't be addressed through modified partnership terms or public relations strategy. The call I'd been expecting came on a Thursday evening, while I was reviewing commission schedules for March and April, which were filling with custom work that demonstrated my business was thriving independent of any corporate partnerships or family business coordination. "Zara, it's Marcus. I think we need to talk." His voice carried a strain I hadn't heard during Christmas Eve dinner when he'd seemed confident about business opportunities and expansion strategy. The media coverage had apparently created pressures that went beyond delayed acquisition timelines, affecting his ability to maintain the financial structure that supported his entire agency. "I'm pretty busy with commission work," I said. "What did you want to discuss?" "I think there's been some misunderstanding about the partnership opportunities I was hoping to explore with you. The recent media coverage has presented my business model in ways that don't accurately reflect what I'm trying to accomplish with artisan collaboration." The phrasing suggested he understood that the information campaign had been more coordinated than random professional networking, and that my refusal to engage with his collaboration offers had been strategic rather than simply personal preference. "I don't think there's been any misunderstanding," I said. "I've learned enough about your partnership structure to know that it wouldn't be appropriate for my business model. Zara, I need you to understand that this media attention is creating serious problems that go beyond business partnerships. There are financial commitments involved that affect people we both care about." The reference to people we both care about confirmed that Marcus understood my mother's investment exposure and was hoping to use family financial pressure to motivate my cooperation with damage control efforts. "What kind of cooperation are you looking for?" "I'd like you to consider making a public statement clarifying that your decision not to pursue partnership opportunities was based on personal business preferences, rather than concerns about Caldwell's practices. Something that would help correct the impression that informed artisans avoid working with my agency." The request revealed the depth of his desperation. Marcus needed me to publicly endorse his business model in order to repair the reputation damage that was making both artisan acquisitions and corporate clients unavailable. My refusal to participate in partnerships had become the foundation for industry-wide resistance that threatened his entire financial structure. "Marcus, I can't make public statements endorsing business practices that I have genuine concerns about. That wouldn't be honest or helpful for other artisans who are evaluating similar opportunities." "Then what would it take for you to consider some kind of collaboration that would demonstrate that Caldwell Creative Solutions can work successfully with independent artists?" The question revealed that he still didn't understand the fundamental problem with his business model. Marcus was offering to modify the terms of individual partnerships without addressing the systematic issues that made his approach problematic for any artisan who valued independence and client relationship control. "There's nothing you could offer that would make me interested in a partnership," I said, "but I appreciate you clarifying where things stand. Zara, you need to understand that if my business fails, your mother is going to lose a significant amount of money. Her investment included personal guarantees that could affect her retirement security." The threat was delivered gently, positioned as concern for family financial well-being rather than pressure for my cooperation. But the underlying message was clear. Marcus expected me to prioritize my mother's investment returns over my own business independence and the well-being of other artisans who might be targeted by his acquisition strategy.
I understand that my mother made investment decisions that carried financial risks, I said, but those risks were based on business projections that included acquiring my cooperation without my knowledge or consent. The fact that those projections were unrealistic doesn't create an obligation for me to help salvage them.
Marcus was quiet for a long moment, apparently processing the reality that family pressure wouldn't motivate my participation in damage control efforts. "I hope you understand what you're doing to your own family," he said finally. "I understand exactly what I'm doing," I replied. "I'm protecting my business from a partnership that would have undermined everything I've built over the past 5 years." The conversation ended with Marcus hanging up without saying goodbye, leaving me alone in my studio with the satisfaction of having clearly communicated my position and the anticipation of whatever family conversations would follow his recognition that I wouldn't be manipulated into cooperation. The family response came the following Saturday, in the form of my mother appearing at my studio without warning or invitation, carrying herself with the rigid composure that meant she was angry but trying to maintain the appearance of reasonable discussion. "Zara, we need to talk about what you've done to Marcus's business." I look up from the wedding band set I was finishing, noting that she'd said "what you've done" rather than asking what had happened or expressing concern about the media coverage. The phrasing confirmed that she understood my role in the information campaign that had undermined Marcus's acquisition strategy. "What I've done is make sure other artisans understand what his partnership agreements actually involve. I think that's been helpful for the creative community. You've destroyed a legitimate business and threatened our family's financial security out of spite because you didn't want to accept help growing your little jewelry hobby." Little jewelry hobby. The phrase distilled everything that was wrong with my family's understanding of what I'd built and why I'd chosen to build it independently. Zara Novak saw my business as a temporary interest that should be subordinated to larger financial opportunities, not as a sustainable career that provided both creative fulfillment and economic independence. "Mom, Marcus's business model was designed to acquire successful artisans and make them dependent on his agency for corporate work they could potentially develop independently. That's not help, that's exploitation disguised as opportunity. You don't understand business, Zara. Sometimes you have to work with other people to achieve things you couldn't accomplish on your own. Marcus was offering you access to clients and projects that would have doubled your income. By giving up control over my client relationships and becoming a subcontractor instead of a business owner. By growing beyond what you could achieve working alone in this little studio, making one piece at a time for people who probably can't even afford to pay you properly." The dismissal was complete and revealing. My mother saw custom jewelry creation as inherently limited, valuable only insofar as it could be scaled and systematized through partnerships that would transform craft into commerce. She didn't understand that the limitation was actually the appeal, the ability to create unique pieces that reflected individual relationships and stories rather than mass market demand. "I can afford my studio rent, my living expenses, and my business growth because my clients value custom work enough to pay appropriately for it," I said. "I don't need to scale beyond what makes me happy in order to be successful. Happiness doesn't pay for retirement, Zara. Happiness doesn't build wealth that protects you when you're too old to work. Marcus was offering you a chance to think bigger than your immediate satisfaction. Marcus was offering me a chance to give up everything I've built in exchange for becoming a component in his business model. The fact that you invested in that business model means you bet against my ability to succeed independently." Diana's composure finally cracked, revealing the anger that had been driving the conversation from the beginning. "I invested in Marcus's business because I believed he could help you achieve more than you were willing to achieve on your own. Everything we've done has been about creating opportunities for you to grow beyond your limitations. Everything you've done has been about proving that my choices are wrong and that you know better how I should run my life and my business. We know better, because we have perspective you don't have. We understand what real success looks like, and it doesn't look like working alone in a rented studio making jewelry for other people's special occasions." The conversation continued for another 20 minutes, circling through variations of the same fundamental disagreement about what constituted meaningful work and appropriate measures of business success. My mother couldn't understand why I would choose independence over expansion, and I couldn't understand why she would invest in a business model designed to undermine the very independence I value. When she finally left, I sat alone in my studio surrounded by the custom pieces that represented 5 years of building something sustainable and personally meaningful. The afternoon light through my windows caught the stones I'd been setting, creating small rainbows that reminded me why I'd chosen this work over the corporate security I'd left behind. My phone buzzed with a text from Tessa. "Saw your mom's car outside your studio. Everything okay?" I typed back a quick response. "Family conversation about financial consequences of my business choices. Nothing I haven't heard before. Want company? I have wine and the latest update on Marcus's situation." "What kind of update?" "The kind that suggests your information campaign worked even better than we hoped." Tessa arrived 30 minutes later with a bottle of Oregon Pinot Noir and printed copies of business filings that showed Caldwell Creative Solutions had missed key loan payments and was facing accelerated debt collection from multiple credit. The media coverage had triggered cancellation clauses in several client contracts, destroying the revenue projections that supported Marcus's leveraged expansion. "It gets better," Tessa said, settling onto my studio couch with the wine and documentation. 3 of his biggest corporate clients have terminated their contracts early, citing concerns about associating with agencies that exploit local creative community. His artisan acquisition program is completely dead, and his traditional marketing services are being questioned by companies that don't want to appear insensitive to creative community concerns. The information confirmed that the business model Patricia had documented was collapsing exactly as we'd predicted, but faster than market forces alone would have achieved. Media attention had accelerated the financial consequences by making Marcus's practices publicly controversial rather than just privately problematic. "What does this mean for my mother's investment?" Based on the debt structure and personal guarantees Patricia documented, your mother is looking at total loss of her initial investment, plus potential additional liability for business debts that exceed the company's assets. The financial consequences were more severe than I'd anticipated, but they flowed directly from investment decisions my mother had made without consulting me about their implications for my business and independence. Zara Novak had chosen to bet against her own daughter's success, and that bet was now producing exactly the losses that any informed analysis would have predicted. "Do you feel bad about what's happening to your family's investment, Tessa?" I considered the question while looking at the custom pieces spread across my workbench, each one representing a client relationship built through trust and mutual respect rather than manipulation and dependency creation. "I feel bad that my mother thought undermining my independence was a profitable investment strategy," I said. "But I don't feel responsible for the financial consequences of that choice." The distinction felt important. I hadn't set out to destroy Marcus's business or cost my family money, but I had prioritized protecting my own work and helping other artisans make informed decisions about partnership opportunity. The market correction that followed was the natural result of transparency replacing the information asymmetry that had made predatory practices profitable. 2 weeks later, Caldwell Creative Solutions filed for bankruptcy protection, unable to meet debt obligations after the loss of both artisan partnerships and corporate clients made their business model financially unworkable. The filing triggered the personal guarantee provisions that made my mother liable for business debts exceeding the company's liquidated assets. Marcus called one final time, his voice carrying the hollow tone of someone whose carefully constructed plans had collapsed, despite his confidence in their inevitability. "I hope you're satisfied with what you've accomplished," he said. "I'm satisfied that I protected my business and helped other artisans understand what your partnerships actually involved," I replied. "You destroyed a legitimate business opportunity out of stubbornness and spite. I exposed a predatory business model by making sure your targets had accurate information about what partnerships with your agency would actually involve. Your mother is going to lose everything because you couldn't see beyond your own narrow interest. My mother is going to face financial consequences because she invested in a business model designed to exploit independent creators, including her own daughter." Marcus hung up without saying goodbye, leaving me alone in my studio with the understanding that the financial warfare was over and the family conversation phase was about to begin. Spring arrived early in Portland that year, bringing cherry blossoms and clarity in equal measure. By mid-March, I'd completed the Morrison wedding commission that Tessa had mentioned months ago, a matching set of engagement ring, wedding band, and anniversary necklace that told the story of a couple's relationship through carefully chosen gemstones and metalwork detail. The project had challenged every skill I'd developed over 5 years of independent work, and completing it felt like proof that my business model was not only sustainable but genuinely thriving. The financial fallout from Caldwell Creative Solutions' bankruptcy had settled into a new normal for my family that didn't include me. Diana had lost her initial investment and faced additional liability that required selling the Lake Oswego house and moving to a smaller property in Beaverton. Brooke and Marcus were separating, with Brooke claiming she'd been unaware of the extent of his predatory business practices when she'd coordinated the initial approaches to my business. I learned these details through Tessa rather than direct family communication, since my mother and sister had decided that my refusal to cooperate with damage control efforts made me responsible for their financial losses. The narrative they'd constructed positioned me as selfish and vindictive, someone who'd chosen personal stubbornness over family loyalty and economic pragmatism. The story felt familiar because I'd been hearing versions of it my entire life, whenever my choices didn't align with their expectations or priority. This time, however, the consequences were too significant to ignore or minimize, and the coordination they'd attempted was too documented to deny or reframe as misunderstanding. Patricia Caldwell had moved back to Seattle after Marcus's business failure, but she called occasionally to check on how I was handling the family aftermath and to share updates about other artisans who'd benefited from the information campaign that exposed predatory partnership practices throughout the region. 3 different creators have told me that your willingness to speak publicly about questionable business models helped them recognize and avoid similar situations, she said during one of these calls. You probably prevented more exploitation than you realized. The validation meant something, but it wasn't why I'd chosen to resist Marcus's acquisition strategy. I'd protected my business because independence was worth more to me than any partnership could offer, and I'd shared information with other artisans because transparency was better than allowing them to make uninformed decisions about their professional future. The personal cost had been the relationship with my family, but that relationship had been conditional on my willingness to subordinate my judgment to their priority. When I'd refused to accept that subordination, they'd revealed that their support was transactional rather than genuine, dependent on my compliance with their vision of appropriate success. My studio felt different after everything that had happened, not because the physical space had changed, but because my relationship to the work had evolved. Each commission represented a choice to value craftsmanship over scalability, client relationships over market expansion, creative satisfaction over maximum profit. These choices had been tested through external pressure and family manipulation, and they'd proved resilient enough to protect what mattered most about the business I'd built. The silver earrings inspired by frost patterns had found their way to a display case in my studio, not for sale but as a reminder of the winter when I'd learned that some betrayals reveal truth rather than creating problems. My family's coordination against my independence had forced me to understand the difference between support and control, between opportunity and exploitation, between love and transaction. Sarah Chen stopped by one afternoon in early April bringing chocolate samples from a new line she'd developed specifically for independent retailers who valued artisanal quality over corporate convenience. Her business had recovered from the revenue loss caused by Marcus's replacement strategy, and she'd built new relationships with clients who appreciated direct communication and collaborative problem solving. I wanted to thank you again for making sure other creators understood what those partnerships actually involved, she said, settling into the chair I kept for client consultation. I've heard from at least 6 artisans who avoided similar situations because they knew what questions to ask and what warning signs to watch for. How's your business doing now? Better than it was when I was depending on Marcus's corporate connection. It turns out that building direct relationships with clients takes more effort initially, but it's more sustainable long-term. I don't have to worry about someone else controlling my access to the work that supports me. Sarah's experience reflected what I'd discovered through my own resistance to partnership pressure. Independence might require more individual effort, but it provided security that couldn't be undermined by other people's decisions or business failure. The trade-off between ease and autonomy was worth making if autonomy mattered more than convenience. We talked for an hour about business development strategies that supported artisan independence, sharing resources and referral networks that helped creators build sustainable enterprises without sacrificing control over their work or client relationships. The conversation felt like the community building that Marcus had claimed to offer through his agency, but without the hidden agenda of dependency creation and eventual replacement. Later that afternoon, I received an unexpected visitor that forced me to address the family relationships I'd been avoiding since the bankruptcy resolution. Brooke appeared at my studio door, carrying herself with the careful composure of someone who'd rehearsed what she planned to say but wasn't confident about how it would be received. "Zara, do you have a few minutes to talk?" I gestured her inside, noting that she looked different than she had during Christmas Eve dinner. The designer clothes and expensive accessories had been replaced by more modest styling that suggested financial circumstances had changed along with family dynamic. Her marriage to Marcus was ending, and the real estate market had slowed enough to affect her income from luxury property sales. "I wanted to apologize for my role in what happened with Marcus's business proposition," she said, settling carefully into the client consultation chair. "I didn't fully understand what his partnership model involved or how it might affect your business." The apology felt rehearsed but not insincere, like she'd spent time thinking about responsibility and consequences in ways that hadn't been necessary when the coordination was producing anticipated results rather than financial disaster. "What did you understand about it?" "I thought Marcus was offering you access to corporate clients that would help you expand beyond custom commissions. I knew Mom had invested in his agency, but I assumed that meant he was successful enough to create genuine opportunities for local artists." "And the emergency request for corporate gifts? The timing right before he contacted me about collaboration." Brooke was quiet for a moment, looking at the custom pieces displayed throughout my studio with what seemed like genuine appreciation for the craftsmanship and attention to detail that defined my approach to jewelry creation. "Marcus suggested that demonstrating your flexibility with last-minute requests would help him present partnership opportunities more effectively. I thought it was about showing corporate clients that you could handle their timelines and specifications." "So you knew it was a test." "I knew it was connected to his interest in working with you, but I didn't understand that your refusal would be used as evidence that artisans are unreliable for corporate work. I thought he genuinely wanted to collaborate, not create situations that would make collaboration seem necessary." The explanation revealed the sophisticated nature of Marcus's manipulation, which had convinced even family members to participate in strategies they didn't fully understand. Brooke had been a tool rather than a co-conspirator used to create the appearance of emergency need that would justify subsequent partnership offers. "I'm sorry that I got pulled into something that was designed to undermine your independence," she continued. "I should have asked more questions about what Marcus was actually trying to accomplish. And Mom, do you think she understood what her investment was supporting?" Brooke considered the question carefully, apparently weighing family loyalty against honest assessment of Diana's financial decisions and their implications for my business. "I think Mom understood that Marcus's success depended on acquiring artisan partnerships, and I think she understood that you were specifically targeted for acquisition. But I'm not sure she fully grasped how those acquisitions were structured or what they would mean for the artisan's ability to work independently. Or she understood perfectly and decided that my independence was less important than her investment returns. Maybe. I don't know how to parse the difference between not understanding consequences and not caring about them when the financial stakes were significant." The conversation continued for another 30 minutes, covering topics that had been avoided during years of family gatherings, where maintaining surface harmony had been prioritized over addressing fundamental disagreements about values and priority. Brooke's apology felt genuine, but it was also limited by her continued inability to fully comprehend why I'd chosen independence over partnership opportunities that might have produced higher income. "What happens now?" she asked as she prepared to leave. "Now I continue building my business the way I always have, one commission at a time, with clients who value custom work enough to pay appropriately for it. And us, our family." I looked around my studio, at the tools that had become extensions of my hands, at the custom pieces that represented relationships built through trust and mutual respect, at the business I'd protected by refusing to subordinate my judgment to other people's priorities. "I don't know," I said honestly.
I think that depends on whether you and Mom can accept that my choices about my business and my life are mine to make, even when you disagree with them." Brooke nodded, but her expression suggested she still didn't fully understand why I would prioritize independence over family harmony and financial optimization. The gap between our perspectives felt too wide to bridge through conversation, rooted in fundamental differences about what constituted meaningful success and appropriate measures of personal achievement. After she left, I returned to the commission work that grounded me in purpose beyond family drama and business warfare. A custom necklace for a client celebrating her PhD defense, with stones chosen to represent the colors of the university where she'd spent 6 years researching environmental sustainability. The piece required techniques I was still perfecting, challenging me to grow as an artisan while creating something that would mark a significant personal milestone. This was what Marcus's partnership model would have eliminated: the direct relationship between creator and client, the personal stories that informed design choices, the satisfaction of solving technical challenges that served individual rather than mass market needs. His business model had treated these elements as inefficiencies to be streamlined rather than features to be preserved and celebrated. The phone rang as I was setting the final stone, a call from a number I didn't recognize but answered anyway, curious about what new opportunity or challenge might be emerging from the wreckage of winter's conflicts. "Ms. Novak, this is Rebecca Martinez from Pacific Arts Quarterly. We're putting together a feature story about independent artisans who've successfully resisted pressure to join larger commercial ventures, and we'd love to include your perspective on maintaining creative autonomy in today's business environment." The request felt like validation but also like responsibility. Other creators were facing similar pressures from agencies and partnerships that promised expansion at the cost of independence, and my experience with Marcus's acquisition strategy could provide useful guidance for artisans evaluating their own opportunities and risks. "What kind of perspective are you looking for? We're interested in how successful independent creators evaluate partnership opportunities, what warning signs they watch for, and how they maintain business sustainability without sacrificing creative control." The interview took place the following week, resulting in a feature article that positioned my resistance to Caldwell's partnership offers as an example of informed decision-making rather than stubborn individualism. The story included practical advice about contract evaluation and business relationship assessment, along with resources for artisans who wanted to build sustainable enterprises without compromising their independence. The publication led to speaking opportunities at craft fairs and business workshops, where I found myself sharing strategies for maintaining creative autonomy while building financially viable enterprise. The conversations felt like the community building that Marcus had claimed to facilitate, but based on mutual support rather than dependency creation. 6 months after Marcus's bankruptcy, I received a letter forwarded through my business address from an attorney representing the liquidation of Caldwell Creative Solutions assets. Enclosed was a check for $800, described as my share of recovered assets from partnerships that had been terminated when the business failed. The amount was tiny compared to the financial losses my family had suffered, but it felt symbolically significant. Marcus's predatory business model had been so thoroughly exposed and rejected that even the bankruptcy process had recognized independent artisans as creditors, rather than subcontractors, entitled to compensation for work completed before the agency's collapse. I deposited the check and used the money to purchase new tools that would allow me to attempt techniques I'd been curious about but hadn't had the equipment to explore. The investment felt like closing a circle, using resources recovered from Marcus's failure to expand the capabilities that made independent work sustainable and satisfying. That evening, I called Patricia Caldwell to thank her for the documentation that had made informed resistance possible and to let her know how the situation had ultimately resolved. "I'm glad you were able to protect your business," she said. "I've been following the coverage of your speaking engagements, and it sounds like you've turned a defensive action into something that benefits the broader creative community. It wasn't planned that way, but sharing information about predatory business practices seems to be helping other artisans avoid similar situations. That's exactly what should happen when exploitation is exposed. The market corrects itself once people understand what they're actually being offered." The conversation reminded me that resistance to exploitation could be both personal protection and community service, that defending individual independence could strengthen the conditions that made independence possible for others. Marcus's business model had depended on artisans making uninformed decisions about partnership opportunities, and transparency had been the most effective weapon against that dependence. As summer settled over Portland, my studio became a place of quiet productivity and creative challenge, filled with commissions that pushed my skills while connecting me to clients whose stories became part of the jewelry they commissioned. The rhythm of careful work provided daily proof that independence was not just sustainable but generative, creating value that couldn't be replicated through mass production or corporate partnerships. The family relationships remained unresolved, but they no longer felt urgent or problematic. Diana and Brooke had made their choices about what mattered most to them, and I had made mine. The difference was that my choices had been informed by complete information about consequences and alternatives, while theirs had been based on assumptions about what I should want and what success should look like. On a quiet Tuesday in August, while setting stones into an anniversary ring that would mark 40 years of marriage for clients who'd commissioned pieces from me for each decade milestone, I realized that the business I'd built was exactly what I'd hoped it would become when I'd left the tech industry 5 years earlier. Sustainable, creative, connected to human stories, and completely under my control. The challenges Marcus had presented had tested that business model against external pressure and family manipulation, and it had proved resilient enough to survive while maintaining the characteristics that made it personally meaningful. Independence hadn't been compromised, and the work continued to provide both creative satisfaction and financial security. The silver earrings inspired by frost patterns still sat in my display case, no longer symbols of winter conflicts, but reminders of seasonal change, and the way difficult periods could produce unexpected beauty. They caught the late afternoon light streaming through my studio windows, creating small rainbows that danced across the workbench where I was creating something new for people who understood the value of custom work. My phone buzzed with a text from a potential new client, someone referred by Sarah Chen who wanted to discuss commissioning wedding jewelry that would incorporate stones from a family heirloom ring. The work would be technically challenging and emotionally significant, exactly the kind of project that made independent practice worthwhile. I finished setting the anniversary ring stones and reached for my appointment calendar, ready to schedule another consultation that would begin another story of personal celebration marked by custom craftsmanship. The business continued, sustained by relationships built through trust rather than dependency, creating beauty that would outlast whatever conflicts had once threatened to disrupt its growth. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.